All right. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to go through real quick and go through some of the logical reasoning questions that I presented a few weeks ago back in one of the club meetings, but I figured I'd upload it here too, just in case people wanted to go back to it. So I'm just going to go through a couple questions that I had set up and just go through exactly how I go about solving them in the actual LSAT. So this first one says here the bacteria from food can survive for several days on the surface of plastic cutting boards, but bacteria can penetrate wooden cutting boards almost immediately, leaving the surface free of contamination. Therefore, wooden cutting boards, unlike plastic cutting boards, need not be washed in order to prevent the contaminating food that is cut on them. Wiping them off to remove food debris is sufficient. All right, so this is kind of the basic standard of question you're going to get for logical reasoning. It's asking you to find what the problem is in this reasoning. And a problem in reasoning is usually that they assume something that they shouldn't really assume. So in this case, what do we have? It says basically that bacteria penetrates wooden cutting boards, so the surface is not contaminated, therefore you don't need to wash it. All right. So I have the question stem separate from the possible answers because I want to get you in the habit of trying to predict what the problem is before you get to the questions, because it's much easier to look for something you already know is probably the issue and find it and then move on to the next one than it is to try to look at all four of the possible answers and try to plug them in backwards. It takes a lot more time. It's easier to confuse yourself that way. So in general, you want to try to have a good idea what the issue is before you're looking at the possible answers. So in this case, this seems dubious, right? And why is that? So it's basically saying if bacteria penetrates, then you won't ever need to watch it because it's penetrated, it's in there. But what's the issue? Let's look at the possible answer. I'm not going to tell you what the issue is before we look at the answers, but just try to think to yourself, what do you think is the issue here? And then whatever you're thinking of, let's see if it's one of the possible answers. So A, washing plastic cutting boards does not remove all bacteria from the surface. Leave it. Leave it, girl. The dog just barking. B, I don't know why that is a question mark. Anyway, B, prevention of bacteria contamination is the only respect in which wooden cutting boards are superior to plastic cutting boards. So let's go through these. So that doesn't have anything to do with the conclusion that they get. The conclusion they arrive at is that you don't need to wash wooden cutting boards, right? And so we're looking for a problem with how they got to that solution, how they got to that conclusion of the whole thing. So plastic cutting boards, that's not what the conclusion was about. Prevention of bacteria contamination is only respect in which wooden cutting boards are superior to plastic cutting boards. Nope, that's outside the scope of this question. This question is just talking about the bacteria contamination. There could be other reasons. It's possible, but that's not concerning the argument we're trying to make here. That's a larger issue than what we're talking about in this specific chain of logic. C, food that is not already contaminated with bacteria can be contaminated only by being cut on contaminated cutting boards. Again, outside the scope. When you see something like only, right? See, both these have that. It's questioning whether or not there are other things that can cause it. And that's not really relevant for this specific question because we're just talking about the fact that supposedly, according to the logic we read, you don't need to wash wooden cutting boards. That's the only thing we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with other ways that food can be contaminated. Not our problem. Just as we're not dealing with the comparison of wooden and plastic cutting boards overall, just considering this one respect. So it's not C. All right, D, bacteria that penetrate into wooden cutting boards do not reemerge on the surface after the cutting boards have been used. See, that's a good point, isn't it? So the logic chain we looked at said, okay, it's penetrated, therefore you're not going to need to wash it, you're fine. That kind of assumes, doesn't it, that penetrating is forever, that it doesn't come back up to the top to contaminate your food. So D is a good idea. Let's look at E. Washing wooden cutting boards kills bacteria below the surface of the cutting boards. No, we don't need that for this argument because the argument is basically saying that once it's down in there, once it's once it's penetrated, it's not going to come back to the top, which is where it contaminates stuff. That's the argument they're trying to make. So the fact that washing a cutting board kills bacteria below the surface, that would actually cut against this argument, right? That'd be a flaw in it. We're looking for what they assumed. Remember, we're looking for something that they assumed without proof. D, they kind of assumed that once it penetrates, it doesn't come back up, right? So that's a better answer. E here, this is not something that they would have assumed. This is something that cuts exactly against their arguments that, hey, if you wash it, that'll actually destroy the bacteria below too. That's not what they assumed. That's something contradictory to their argument. And remember what we're trying to find here? Trying to find the thing that they assumed, that they shouldn't have assumed, that made their logic wrong. So answer is D for that reason. Next question. Altogether, the students, there should be an S there, the students in Mrs. Tarnowski's Milton Elementary School class collected more aluminum cans than did the students in any of the school's other classes. Therefore, the Milton student who collected the most aluminum cans was in Miss Tarnowski's class. All right, which of the following arguments contain flawed reasoning that is most parallel to that in the argument above? All right, so step 1, just like before, what's the problem in this? Now, in this one, they said the students, that should be an S again, in Mrs. Tarnowski's class collectively sold more cans than students in any other class. And that from that, they try to conclude that the student who collected the most was in Mrs. Tarnowski's class. Now, that is what you can simply refer to as trying to assume something about one specific case from something overall. They're assuming because overall her class sold more cans than anyone else, that specifically the one student who sold the most has to be in her class. Which obviously, isn't the case because we're measuring students collectively, right? So there's a clear problem there. So what we're going to look for in these following options that they're going to give us is something with the same flaw, that they take something general and try to apply it to a specific. That doesn't work. So let's look at our options. Altogether, more trees are planted by the students in Mr. Kelly's class than were planted in those in Mrs. Lane's class and Mrs. Jackson's class combined. Therefore, Mr. Kelly's students planted more trees than Mrs. Jackson's students planted. See, there's no actual problem with that reasoning. That's fine. That's true. If Kelly's class sold more than both Liang's and Jackson's, then yeah, he has to have sold more than Jackson's because, Jackson plus Liang is still less than Kelly. So Kelly is more than Jackson. Makes sense. B, more than half of the Milton Elementary School students play in the band and more than half of the school students sing in the choir. Therefore, every student at Milton Elementary School either plays in the band or sings in the choir. See, that's false, right? Because it could be the case that, well, that's false, but it's not the same kind of false that we're dealing with here. That's false for another reason. Because let's say 51% of the students play in the band, and that's more than half, and 51% of school students sing in the choir. Now imagine that those two 51% are just the same people. 51% of the students at the school are both in the choir and in the band. That could be the case. That doesn't mean that every student either plays in the band or sings in the choir. They kind of assume that the people in the band and the people in the choir have to be separate when there could be a decent amount of overlap. So that's what the problem is there, but that's not the problem we're looking for, right? Remember, we're trying to find something where they take something general and apply it where they shouldn't to a specific. So C, Mr. Rose, Milton Elementary School class, raised more money by selling candy bars than Mrs. Hunt's class raised by holding a raffle. Therefore, the number of candy bars sold by Mr. Rose's class was greater than the number of raffle tickets sold by Mrs. Hunt's class. All right, see, this is another issue. Again, not the same issue that we're looking for, but in this one, it says that they raised more money by selling candy bars. And from that, they try to conclude that the number of candy bars was greater. But that's not necessarily the case. This argument right here assumes that the price of candy bars and the price of a raffle ticket were the same, right? Which could not be the case. It could be that they sold the candy bars for $5 each and the raffle tickets were 25 cents. Therefore, the ones selling candy bars wouldn't really need to have more individual candy bars sold than raffle tickets sold because, one candy bar counts for a lot more money than does a raffle ticket. So that's the problem there, is they try to equate the money made and the number of a specific thing. But that's not the issue we're looking for. We're looking for a general that they apply wrongly to a specific. So D, the number of tickets to the school fair sold by the students in Mrs. Ramirez's Milton Elementary School class was greater than the number sold by Milton students from any other class. Therefore, the Milton student who sold the most tickets to the school fair was a student in Mrs. Ramirez's class. That's pretty much exactly what we're looking for. That's like 90% similar to the argument we just heard in the question stem. So yeah, they do the total number of tickets in the class was greater than everyone else. Therefore, the specific student with the most tickets had to have been in that class. Same exact fraud, same exact reasoning. That's the answer. And then let's check E just for sure. Mrs. Ventura's Milton Elementary School class assembles more birdhouses than did any of the school's other classes. Since Mrs. Ventura's class had fewer students than any other Milton class, her students assembled more bird cases on average than did the students in any other Milton class. Okay, yeah, well, if you know how calculating averages work, yeah, that's just true. If her class is fewer than everyone else and yet they sold more, then yes, on average, they sold, each individual one did sell more. That's not flawed reasoning, and that's not the problem we're looking for here, which is applying a general to a specific. So the answer there is D. And in general, when you're going through the test, what you're going to want to do is once you have the answer and you're sure about it, if you're not sure, keep looking. But if you have the answer, just pick it and move on. You don't really need to look at the rest. That's just going to take time that you could be spending on a harder question. So if you know what the answer is before you look at the questions, you look at the questions and you find it. That's all you need. You don't need to spend any more time. I'm going through all of them here just because for the sake of exercise and getting used to some of these arguments that'll come up more often than others, it's best if I, go through all of them and you hear all of them. So that's what I'm doing, but you don't need to do that yourself when you're going through. Now, next one, newspaper editor. Law enforcement experts, as well as most citizens, have finally come to recognize that legal prohibitions against gambling all share a common flaw. No matter how diligent the effort, the laws are impossible to enforce. Ethical qualms notwithstanding, when a law fails to be effective, it should not be a law. That is why there should be no legal prohibition against gambling. So again, they're assuming something that they shouldn't have assumed that needs to be assumed for the argument to work. So let's look at this. What does it look like they assumed? Now, the easiest way to find an assumption is you see two things that don't quite connect, and they need to have something in between to connect them. Like the argument goes from A to C, and there needed to be a B in there somewhere. There needed to be some sort of connection. So looking through this, legal prohibitions against gambling are impossible to enforce. And when a law fails to be effective, it should not be a law. So you can, all this mumbo jumbo, you can reduce to pretty much like 3 statements. So prohibitions against gambling are impossible to enforce. Part 1. When a law fails to be effective, it should not be a law. Part 2. And then that leads to the conclusion, legal prohibitions against gambling should not exist. So we're looking for a something that they assumed going from the first point to the second point there. There's got to be some disconnect between gambling laws being impossible to enforce and when a law fails to be effective, it should not be a law. They didn't connect those two good enough. And so one of the easiest things you can do is just see where they use different words. Like they say the laws are impossible to enforce, and then they talk about being effective. Are impossible to enforce and effective the same thing? Not necessarily, right? So it could be that something is impossible to enforce, but simply because it's a law, people kind of obey it anyway. Even they don't really think about how hard it is to enforce. So effective and impossible to enforce might not be the same thing, right? There could be other qualities, other variables that go into being effective other than just how it's enforced. So there seems to be a disconnect there. They used 2 different words. They didn't connect it. So let's see what we got. What did they assume? That no effective law is unenforceable. That matches what I was saying, right? they assume that if a law is effective, let's say, wait, sometimes they get you with the wording. Let's check this. No effective law is unenforceable. I think that sounds right. So see, they're assuming that if it's effective, it has to be enforceable, when there could be other reasons for it being effective. So I'm thinking A sounds about right, but let's see. B, all enforceable laws are effective. Oh, see, they're trying to trick you. That goes the other way, right? What they needed to show that they didn't is that in order to be effective, it has to be enforceable. Not the other way around. This one says that they're assuming that all enforceable laws are effective, not that all effective laws are enforceable. Right? See what they're doing there? They're doing some word games with you. So C, no legal prohibitions against gambling are enforceable. They didn't assume that. They just told you that. They said all prohibitions against gambling share one common flaw. They're not enforceable. So no, that's not something that they assumed. That's something they just told you. So, I should probably explain that, because when we're looking for something that they assume, it's not something that they told us. Assume means they left it out. They left it out of their reasoning chain. They did not include it without specifying. They just assumed it was true. If they told you something, that's not assuming. All right. If they tell, because what you do in these types of questions is you assume that everything they tell you is true. If they say that no prohibition against gambling is enforceable, you assume that it's true because it was in the question. So that's not an assumption. That's just a premise that they gave us. D, most citizens must agree with the law for the law to be effective. They didn't say why it wasn't effective. And they said they did use the phrase, they talked about citizens, but they said it in the context that citizens recognize the laws to be unenforceable. So that's not the context which they use this. See, they'll try to use words from the question and be like, oh, so you look at it and say, oh, look, I saw that word. I know that phrase. They did use that, correct. But no, that's not the way they used the phrase in the question. They never said that the effectivity of the law depended on people agreeing with it. That wasn't even at issue. So D and E, we can just discount for that reason. They never talked about agreeing with the law. They talked about recognizing that it was unenforceable. So looks like the answer here is A. Yep, I guess it is. So because they assumed without proving it that being enforceable is the only thing that matters for being effective. And that if you're not enforceable, you will not be effective. When, like I said, it could be that something's not enforceable, but simply by it being the law, everyone kind of weighs it. That could be the case. That doesn't mean it is the case, but it could be. And they assumed that it wasn't. So you have to take your kind of real life knowledge out of this, because you might assume, oh yeah, if something can't be enforced, it won't be effective. But that's outside knowledge. That has nothing to do with the logical system that they set up here. That has nothing to do with the little syllogism they're trying to create. So ignore that. Ignore whatever you think you know. The caterpillar of the monarch butterfly feeds on minkweed plants, whose toxins, there should be E on that whose, I think, make the adult monarch poisonous to many predators. The viceroy butterfly, whose caterpillars do not feed on milkweed plants, is very similar in appearance to the monarch. Therefore, it can be concluded that the viceroy is so seldom preyed on because of its visual resemblance to the monarch. All right, which of the following, if it were discovered to be true, would most seriously undermine the argument? So these sorts of questions are pretty much the same as find the flaw, right? Because a flaw is something they assumed. And this thing, if we discover something to be true, what it's going to be is we discover something that goes against the assumption that they made, right? Or if they didn't make an assumption, they didn't consider something. They didn't consider that something else might be the case. And we're trying to find what else they might have not considered. So in this situation, what's something else that they failed to consider here? They say that, all right, the monarch caterpillar eats minkweed, which is poisonous to predators, which makes it poisonous to predators. And the viceroy, their caterpillars do not eat those same plants. Okay. I feel like this is something with autocorrect. Milkweed, minkweed, they're supposed to be the same word. So don't think that's the issue here. These should be the same word. I think just when I was typing it up, there was an autocorrect problem and it didn't recognize milkweed, but it's the same. It's the same plant both times. So pick one, either milkweed or minkweed. These should be the same word. So the viceroy butterfly caterpillars do not feed on that same plant, but they look like the monarch. And so from this fact, they conclude that the viceroy is so seldom eaten, preyed on, attacked, because it looks similar to the monarch and the monarch is poisonous. Now it's possible, but what else might they have missed out on? Hey, some predators do not have a toxic reaction to insects that feed on the milkweed plant. Okay, so it's another word game they play with you. They said that the viceroy was seldom preyed on, not that it was never preyed on. So the fact that some predators eat on it is perfectly in line with their logic. So seldom just means not very often, and some predators can mean just one or two. So yeah, that could still work. That doesn't pose a problem for their logic. They never said that all predators have to avoid it for this to be true. B, being toxic to predators will not protect individual butterflies unless most members of the species to which said butterflies belong are similarly toxic. Now, see, that's just confusing, is what that is. So, in general, when you see a question, you're a possible answer, and you're not really sure what it says, just move on and come back to it. Don't spend minutes sitting there because the thing is timed. So, if I were in the test, I would just skip over that. But let's look at it more closely. Being toxic to predators will not protect individual butterflies unless most members of the species to which the butterfly belongs are similarly toxic. See, because if that were the case, it wouldn't help their argument at all, because the viceroy species is not all similarly toxic. So in that case, it would afford no protection to the individual viceroys and they'd all get eaten. So that doesn't actually help their argument. That's not something that it goes against their conclusion is what it does. But that one's just weird. I don't like that. Okay, we're gonna keep it because it's possible. It seems like it might go against, but we're not gonna, hitch our wagon to that one just yet. Because it seems to go against what they're saying, but I don't think it's a problem with their reasoning. It's just the conclusion is different. So, C, some of the predators of the monarch butterfly also prey on viceroys. Now, see, that would actually just help their argument because, if the reason viceroys get attacked so seldom is because they look like monarchs, the fact that the monarch predators attack them would, seem to back that up. So it's not C. So it's not A, it's not C. B, we're considering. D, the viceroy butterfly is toxic to most predators. Oh, see, that's interesting, because if the viceroy is just toxic for its own reasons, that would explain why it doesn't get preyed on very much, right? Not because it looks like the monarch, but because it has its own toxicity. And then that's a good point. So B and D, we'll think about those. And then E, toxicity to predators is the principal means of protection for only a few butterfly species. Again, outside the scope of the argument, that doesn't matter. So we're trying to find something that, if found, would most call into question their reasoning here. So let's look at B again, this confusing ass answer. Being toxic to predators will not protect individual butterflies unless most members of the species to which such butterfly belongs are extremely toxic. Well, see, yeah, because it's not much protection for an individual unless, like, the predators think that, oh, hey, look, that's a member of whatever species, and that species is toxic, I shouldn't eat it. So the fact that they look similar to each other, the viceroy and the monarch, would seem to conclude this, would seem to solve this little issue just fine. Because I think the idea this is trying to get across is that, like, if one butterfly just ate milkweed randomly, that wouldn't really protect it because no predator would know it was poisonous. The only way that a predator knows a specific butterfly is poisonous is if it knows the entire species is. And the only way it would get that knowledge was from, looking at it, right? So if they look the exact same, that would justify it. So I don't think this is that much of a problem to their argument. Whereas D here seems very problematic because their conclusion, remember, right? You got to pay attention to what the conclusion is, not any specific premise. The thing we're trying to undermine here is how they got to their conclusion. What if found would most nullify that? And D here, that the viceroy butterfly is toxic on its own, seems to undermine their conclusion here that the reason it gets preyed on so rarely is because it looks like the monarch. Because D suggests there's another reason for it, which undermines their conclusion. And yep, the answer here is D. All right, studies show that the most creative engineers get their best and most useful ideas only after doodling and jotting down what turns out to be outlandish ideas. Now that many engineers do their work with computers instead of on paper, however, doodling is becoming much less common, and experts fear that the result will be fewer creative and useful engineering ideas. These experts argue that this undesirable consequence would be avoided if computer programs for engineering work included simulated notepads that would allow engineers to suspend their serious work on the computer, type up outlandish ideas, and then quickly return to their original work. All right, same deal. What's an assumption on which their reasoning here depends? What are they assuming? What two things did they not appropriately connect? Give you a second to look at it. All right, so let's go to the possible answers here. Let's see if you find something you like. A, most creative engineers who work with paper and pencil spend about as much time doodling as they spend on what they consider serious work. Okay, that doesn't seem to be a problem for their conclusion here. Remember, the conclusion was that, hey, if we allow them some time to type up some outlandish ideas, they'll do better. I don't think the amount of time is really a problem here. B, simulated notepads would not be used by engineers for any purpose other than typing up outlandish ideas. That's not a problem. They suggested these notepads specifically for that purpose. The fact that it's not used for anything else isn't really a problem for their argument. C, no engineers who work with computers keep paper and pencils near their computers in order to doodle and jot down ideas. Okay, so it doesn't need to be no engineers, right? It just said the fact that computers are the big thing now made it less likely for engineers to jot down. So that doesn't necessitate that no engineers have paper and pencil, right? Just that it makes it less likely. It results in a decrease of jotting down, of doodling, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not C. See, that's another one of the games they'll try to play with you is the see, when you hear something absolutely like only or all or no, then oh no. Well, yes, the answer is going to be D. So, but we already went through A, B, and C, so you knew it was D or E. So I accidentally pressed the button there. But enough said with C. Let's look at D. The physical act of working on paper is not essential in providing engineers with the benefits that can be gained by doodling. That's an interesting point, remember, because in the question, they said that, oh, because jotting things down on paper is so useful, we should give them a notepad that they can type things up for. Now, typing up and doodling with a pen and paper are clearly not the same thing. Typing up and doodling, there's a disconnect there. They used two different words again, and they didn't really justify the separation between them. So that's something that they didn't consider here, that they just assumed that it was not the physical act of writing on paper that was important. They just thought it was coming up with outlandish ideas in general. So D is the answer here. Let's look at E real quick. Most of the outlandish ideas engineers jot down while doodling are later incorporated into projects that are practically complicated. Yeah, that's not a problem for their reasoning. That's fine. In fact, that's good. That makes things even easier. All right, next question. The postmodern view involves, there should be an S, not involved. I'm pretty sure it's still a thing. So involves the rejection of modern assumptions about order and the universality of truth. The grand theories of the modern era are now seen as limited by the social and historical context in which they were elaborated. Also, the belief in order has given way to belief in the importance of irregularity and chaos. It follows that we inhabit a universe full of regular events in which there are no universal truths. Ignore the noise going on in the background, by the way. My dog's barking. There's Christmas music way off in the background, and my grandma's running around. So that's what that is, but hopefully you can still hear me. Anyway, the argument's reasoning is questionable because what? What is the problem with this line of reasoning? Now, keep in mind, we want to be looking for disjuncts for places that aren't quite as connected as they should be. All right. If you see something, keep that in mind. If you don't, well, let's see what the answers are. See if anything jumped out at you. It infers that something is the case because it is believed to be the case. Oh, that's interesting. Because the first two sentences of that were about a viewpoint. They said the postmodern view holds this. People now are starting to believe this. But the last sentence stated it as a definitive. It says it follows that we live in a universe without order and truth, et cetera, et cetera. So it sounds like a good point, doesn't it? They took the fact that some people believe a thing and used to conclude definitively that that thing is true. And people believe wrong things all the time, don't they? So that's a good point. Uses the term universal ambiguously. Didn't seem like it. They used the term universal just fine. They didn't seem to use it in several different contexts. Sometimes you'll get, that happens rarely, but sometimes you'll get a question wherein they use a term very vaguely or they use it twice to mean two different things. But that didn't seem to be a problem there. I didn't have a problem with how they use universal. It seemed fine to me. Same thing for D there. They use the term order just fine, I think. C, relies on the use of emotional terms to bolster its conclusion. There was nothing emotional about that. There was no beat of emotion about that argument. They didn't appeal to something terribly gut-wrenching. So no, I don't think emotion was a problem here. Or E, fails to cite examples of modern theories that purport to embody universal truth. They don't need to go into specifics. They were simply talking about the view that there are no universal truths. They don't need to go through every instance of people believing there were universal truths in order to refute that. That's not really relevant. They can do as many examples as they like. So yes, the answer is A. They inferred that this was true just because people believed it to be true. All right, next one. Game show host. Humans are no better at apes at investing. That is, they do not attain a better return on their investments than apes do. We gave 5 stock analysts and 1 chimpanzee $1,350 each to invest. After 1 month, the chimp won, having increased its net worth by $210. The net worth of the analyst, who came in second, increased by only $140. Each of the following describes a flaw in the game show host reasoning, except. All right, so in this one, they're going to give us several problems, but it's not our job to find what a problem is. We're trying to find something that is not a problem. Try to pay attention to when the question does that, when there's the big except there in bold, in capitalized. So let's go through here and let's see what's not a problem with this. A conclusion is drawn about apes in general on the basis of an experiment involving 1 chimpanzee. That's a good point. That is a problem with this. So that's not the answer we're looking for, because we're looking for something that's not a problem. So if you've ever taken a psych class ever in your life, you'll know that when you do a study, it's very, very, very important to make sure whatever group you use for the study is representative of some population at large, that it actually represents whatever group you're trying to make a claim about. And in this case, they said, hey, look, we had 5 apes and 1 did good. Therefore, apes are better than humans at investing. It's like, nope, you can't assume that based on this study with very, very few participants. And again, you made a conclusion about apes, but it was just the chimpanzee. You can't conclude about all apes now because chimpanzee is only one kind of ape. So there could be other apes that would have done worse. B, no evidence is offered that chimpanzees are capable of understanding stock reports and making reasoned investment decisions. Yeah, that doesn't seem to be a problem to me. They just said the chimpanzees are better at it. Doesn't mean that they need to do all this stuff to be better at it, that they need to understand stock reports and blah, 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 blah. They could just be better because, I don't know, they have an intuitive sense for things. Maybe the chimps are more in tune with the universe than we are, and they're just, if you give them the chance to predict the future, they'll just do better at it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they need to understand stock reports, et cetera, et cetera. So that doesn't seem to be a problem to me. So maybe that's our answer. But let's keep going. C, a broad conclusion is drawn about the investment skill of humans on the basis of what is known about 5 humans. Yep, same thing. They had 5 humans and then tried to generalize about the skill of the entire human race. Can't really do that, not representative. D, too general conclusion is made about investing on the basis of a single experiment involving short-term investing, but not long-term investing. Yeah, it's a good point. That's a problem there. They just said that chimps are better at investing in general, but they had a very limited study here. So when people invest, sometimes it's over years and years that they're trying to hold on to these investments before selling. So good point. E, no evidence is considered about the long-term performance of the chimpanzee's portfolio. Yeah, kind of pretty much the same thing as D again. So seems like B is our answer. Everything else here is a problem for the thing. And remember, we're looking for the one that is not a problem. There's a big capitalized except. So answer B. All right. Hospital executive. At a recent conference on nonprofit management, several computer experts maintained that the most significant threat faced by large institutions such as universities and hospitals is unauthorized access to confidential data. In light of this testimony, we should make the protection of our clients' confidentiality our highest priority. All right, so the hospital executive's argument is vulnerable to which of the following objections? Again, what is the problem here? What is the problem with this reasoning? All right, let's go ahead and see. If you guys got any ideas, let's see if you see them. All right, A, the argument confuses the causes of a problem with the appropriate solutions. Not really. It says, the problem is, keeping things secure and confidentiality, and the solution is, make sure we have good data security and whatnot. That doesn't seem to be too problematic to me. Looks fine. B, the argument relies on the testimony of experts whose expertise is not shown to be sufficiently broad to support their general claim. That's a good point. The whole reason for this argument here is the testimony of computer experts, right? And it said that the computer experts told them that this issue was the biggest problem for universities and hospitals and et cetera, et cetera. You're a computer guy. How do you know all of the problems that a university faces? I'm pretty sure you're only going to know the computer related problems. You're not really going to know stuff with admissions, stuff with financials, stuff with community outreach, et cetera, et cetera. You're just going to know the computer stuff. That's a good point. Just because someone's an expert in one field doesn't mean they're an expert in all fields. And you can't just take what they have to say as being important in whatever field they're in as being the most important thing generally. Good point. Let's look at C. The argument assumes that correlation between two phenomena is evidence that one is the cause of another. Yeah, we all know that correlation, causation, problem, whatever. That doesn't seem to be an issue here. They don't try to make a correlational argument. D, the argument draws a general conclusion about a group based on the data about an unrepresentative sample. That's what we had with the last question. Remember, the chimps and humans were not a representative sample. In this case, they didn't really use that. There's no sample issue. And then E, the argument figures, that should probably be figures, not fingers, that a property belonging to large institutions belongs to all institutions. Yeah, no, it doesn't do that. So our answer here seems to be B. There we go. B is the answer. All too many weaklings are also cowards, and few cowards fail to be fools. Thus, there must be at least one person who is both a weakling and a fool. All right, so we're doing another, trying to find a similar example of flawed reasoning. So in this case, they say that all too many weaklings are also cowards. All right, one, we don't know what percentage that means. All too many? That doesn't really give us much of anything. Maybe two is too many in your opinion. So that's a weird proportion. But okay, there are some number, we don't know what number, there are some number of weaklings that are also cowards. And few cowards fail to be fools. Okay, so few cowards fail to be fools, so maybe that most cowards are fools. All right. So some amount of weaklings are cowards, and most cowards are fools. Thus, there must be at least one person who's both a weakling and a fool. Not necessarily. All right. Let's say all too many weaklings. I don't know what number that is, but let's say 30%. 30% of weaklings are cowards. Actually, let's be really generous. Let's say it actually is a majority. Let's say by all too many, they actually mean a majority here. 51% of weaklings. There are some number of weaklings and 51. Okay, let's make it easy. There are 100 weaklings, and 51 of them are cowards. And now there are some number of cowards. Let's just say 100, and 51% of cowards are fools. So 51% of weaklings are cowards, and 51% of cowards are fools. So there must be at least one person who is both a weakling and a fool. Not really. Because if only 51% of weaklings are cowards, right, that means 49% of weaklings are not cowards. So that group of 49, those 49 weaklings over here that are not cowards, aren't really implicated in the next statement that 51% of the cowards are fools. First of all. Okay, I wish I had something to draw here because I should have thought of that. It's best if I can do this in a little Venn diagram. But I'm trying to think how best to explain this. We also don't know the sizes of each of these populations, right? So I shouldn't have said 100 for each because that's stupid. We don't know that there's an equal number. Perhaps there's lots and lots and lots of cowards. And, you know, there are very few weaklings. So, all right, I just need to give you, okay, I'll give you one example that shows that this is false, right? So they're trying to conclude that there must be at least one person who's both a weakling and a fool. Let's say there are 10 weaklings. There are 10 weaklings, and there is 100 cowards, right? So all too many weaklings are also cowards. So too many of those weaklings are cowards. All too many of those 10 weaklings are cowards. So let's say 7. 7 of the weaklings, of the 10 weaklings, are cowards. And few cowards fail to be fools. So let's say 51 of the 100 cowards are fools. Okay? Thus, there must be at least one person who's both a weakling and a fool. Now, remember, there are only 7 weaklings in the coward category, and there are 51 fools in the coward category. So does it follow that out of 100, the 7 and the 51 have to have some overlap? No. The 7 and the 51 can be completely different. There is no need for them to be the same. So the big problem with this is it doesn't really take into account proportions and what have you. And just the way it's done doesn't prove it. So just because they're of the weaklings, a lot of them are cowards, doesn't really mean that they're a significant portion of the cowards, right? So hell, all the weaklings, if there are 10 weaklings, all the weaklings can be cowards. It only means that 10 out of 100 cowards are weaklings, right? So that's the issue here. I'm trying to, it took me a minute to figure out how the best way to explain that, but hopefully you understand the concept. If you don't, try drawing it out in a Venn diagram because it makes it a bit more sense there. So let's see what has the same problem. All weasels are carnivores, and no carnivores fail to be non-herbivores. So some weasels are non-herbivores. Nope, not the same problem. Firstly, they use the word no again. See, you gotta look out for absolutes like that, because the original question did not have any absolutes. It used words like all too many and few fail to be, not no or all or every, like stuff like that. So no, not the same flawed reasoning here. B, few moralists have the courage to act according to the principles which they profess, and few saints have the ability to articulate the principles by which they live. So it follows that few people can both act like saints and speak like moralists. That's not the same thing. Because that's one, the one we dealt with had like 3 categories, right? It was cowards, fools, and weaklings. This only has 2 categories, you know, the saints and the moralists. So not the same structure here. So not the same thing. C, some painters are dancers, since some painters are musicians, and some musicians are dancers. Okay, let me see. So the conclusion here, they did this one backwards. The conclusion that some painters are dancers. So since some painters are musicians and some musicians are dancers, some painters are dancers. Oh yeah, that seems to be the same thing. So we can do the same thing here. So some painters are musicians. Let's say there's 10 painters and 100 musicians, and 7 painters, 7 of those 10 painters are in the 100 musicians, and some musicians are dancers. 51% of them are dancers, 51 of them are dancers. Does that conclude that the 7 painters and the 51 dancers have to have some overlap? No, same problem. The one confusing thing here might be the fact that they say some, and the other one used phrases, like I said, like all too many or few fail to be, blah, blah, blah. But okay, there's essentially 3 categories, right? There is all, some, and none. So if it said all too many and blah, 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 that's essentially a fancy way of saying some. Unless you're getting into a thing that says most, because then most means at least above 51%, and that gets in the whole thing. And when we went through, I kind of assumed that few fail to be means most, but most and some aren't necessarily different. If I said, I don't know, most Americans are fat. If I made that statement and I said some Americans are fat, they're both true. They're both simultaneously true. So they're not exactly exclusive. But that C seems about right. So let's keep going. If an act is virtuous, then it's autonomous. For acts are not virtuous unless they are free. Okay, say that's another absolute. All virtuous acts have to be free, and that's not what we're dealing with here. Other thing. E, a majority of the voting population favors a total ban, but no one favors a total ban is opposed to stiffer tariffs. So at least one voter is not opposed to stiffer tariffs. No, it's not the 3 categories and trying to make A and C connect just because they're both part of B. That's what we had in the original thing, and that's the same issue with C. That's not what E does. E does something different. So when you're going through questions like this and you know what the problem is, you can recognize certain things pretty fast as not being the same kind. You don't need to spend too much time on it. If it doesn't seem like the same kind of thing, it's not the same kind of thing. You want to be careful though about the ones that flip around like this and have the conclusion first, because it can look like a different structure when it's really not. When it's actually the same structure, they just put the conclusion first. So it looks obvious to me here to see this answer. Yep. All right, so this consumer advocate, he says that the introduction of a new drug into the marketplace should be contingent upon our having a good understanding of its social impact. However, the social impact of the newly marketed antihistamine is far from clear. It is obvious then that there should be a general reduction in the pace of bringing to the market new drugs that are now being tested. All right, so what most strengthens the argument? There's got to be something. Okay, strengthen is kind of similar to find the flaw, because you want to paint over the flaw. You want to specifically state the thing that they're assuming here. They're assuming something, and we want to find it. That if it's true, then the argument works. So what seems clear to me here is that they try to make a conclusion about all the new drugs being tested from the fact that the antihistamine's effects are not clear. So we need something that connects the newly marketed antihistamine to all the new drugs being tested. We need some reason for one to follow from the other. So let's see if we can find one of those. The social impact of the new antihistamine is much better understood than that of most of the new drugs being tested. I see that works. So it said we don't understand the new antihistamine very well. And so, but if that's much better understood than all the rest, if the new antihistamine is the one we understand the best and we don't even understand that one very well, then yeah, we don't understand any of them. So we shouldn't be releasing them, because that was the principle they outlined at the beginning. If we don't understand it very well, don't release it. So yeah, that draws the connection pretty well. Let's see about some of the others though. All right, the social impact of some new drug being tested is poorly understood. Okay, see, just because some are poorly understood, it doesn't follow that we need to stop the release of all of them. So no, that's not the thing. That doesn't draw the connection we need between the antihistamine and the all new drugs being tested. So C, the economic success of some drugs is inversely proportional to how well we understand their social impact. No. That would go against the argument almost, because it's saying that if we understand something less, the economic success will be more. That doesn't have anything to do with the principle. That doesn't connect antihistamines and all of the drugs being tested. That was what we look for, and it doesn't do that. So no. The new antihistamine is chemically similar to some of the new drugs being tested. See, if it were similar to all of the new drugs being tested, then that would provide our connection. But just some is not enough. You gotta remember, be careful of the distinction between some and all. And then E, the new antihistamine should be on the market only if the new drugs being tested should also be on the market. All right, that sounds convincing, so it's trying to trick you, but it should be the other way around, right? For their logic to flow, because they said that we don't understand the antihistamine, therefore we should stop all the new drugs currently being tested from being, released. So if it were true that the other drugs should only be on the market if the antihistamine was, then that would make sense. But this does it backwards. It's saying that the new antihistamine should be on the market only if the other drugs are. But the way they did it in the statement was that because the antihistamine isn't, other drugs should not be also. So they try to flip it. They try to confuse you. Don't do that. The answer is A. And that seems to be the end. All right. Yeah, there we go. That was the last one I had. So there you go. That is the logical reasoning presentation that I had. What should be the big takeaways here? 1, try to predict the answer before you find it because it makes life easy. 2, beware of the difference between all and some and everything in between. So you want to be kind of skeptical of absolutes. Always be clear what the question is asking you. Sometimes they'll throw an except in there, but for the most part, what you're trying to do is find the problem with the argument. So, what the problem usually is that they didn't draw a sufficient connection between two things. They remain unconnected, and you need to find the assumption that they overlooked that they didn't state that would have connected them. So that's the overall message for this one. And with that, I'll end. So have a good one, everyone. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and I'll see you later. All right, bye.